There we go. I'll never forget living in Atlanta, Georgia, and the pollen season and what it did to her respiratory health, because we spent a good year on oxygen after she came home from the hospital. So I'm really interested to talk to all of our panelists, and I think everyone's going to learn quite a bit from the discussion. So my name is Crystal. I'm president of Monarch Weather. This webinar is sponsored by DailyBreath and Monarch. We work in collaboration with the DailyBreath app to provide weather data specifically related to wildfire smoke. And I'll be moderating for the next hour with this wonderful group of panelists. And the way that things are going to go is myself and the panelists will present about 3 slides for the first hour, and then we'll open up to our questions. We have prepared a few questions that we will give to the panelists. That'll take about 2 minutes, and then we'll close with 15 minutes of questions from the audience. So it's important that you think of something, you put it into the chat for us so we have it at the end of the conversation. So if it's a comment or a question that comes up, again, please relay that into the chat for us. I'm going to start by introducing our wonderful set of panelists. I'll stop my video for the sake of bandwidth here. We'll start with Dr. Theresa Crimmins. She is the director for the USA National Phenology Network and has been a part of the organization since 2007. Hailing from Ohio and Michigan, she received a BS and MA at Western Michigan University, PhD from the University of Arizona. In Theresa's role with the network, she supports an amazing team of individuals and works enthusiastically to support the growth and use of phenology data and resources curated by the USANPN, involvement in Nature's Notebook, and a broader appreciation of phenology among scientists and non-scientists alike. Next, we have Dr. Landon Bunderson. Landon obtained a PhD in aerobiology and pollination ecology at the University of Tulsa, where he worked as the field ecologist and aerobiologist on a NASA-funded pollen forecast system project. He spent 2 years at Iowa State University, postdoctoral researcher, where he conducted research on biofuel pollen and managed a corn cropping system database for a $20 million NIFA funded CAP grant. Landon is currently the CEO and co-founder of PollenSense. We have Eric Klos. Eric is the founder, CEO, and innovator of DailyBreath. Eric is a seasoned executive with broad health IT expertise and relevant entrepreneurial skills, inspired to address environmental factors as a determinant of health for vulnerable populations. Eric has spent more than 10,000 hours in the domain of environmental factors and respiratory conditions. He has quickly become a thought leader in understanding the impact of weather and environmental exposures on respiratory patients. His innovation, the DailyBreath mobile app, is available in the App Store or via Google Play. And Dr. Dan Dalan. Dan is board certified allergist at MercyOne Medical Center in Waterloo, Iowa. He has over 35 years of experience in the medical field. Dr. Dalan has focused experience with environmental allergies specifically. For over 20 years, he has been a certified pollen counter. He is the medical director of the North Dakota National Allergy Bureau. He has held leadership positions around aerobiology and informatics and within the American Academy of Allergies, Asthma, and Immunology. Welcome to our panelists, and thank you for taking the time to be here for this important discussion. I'm going to kick things off with a look at our climate, because ultimately what we're seeing day to day, what your weather is going to be like on this Thursday, no matter where you live in the country, our weather is changing. It has been changing for hundreds of thousands of years. And ultimately our climate norms are shifting. And so all of this is going to impact the heat we see, the humidity, winds, precipitation. That's all directly going to correlate with allergen impacts for vulnerable patients especially. So when we look at a warming trend, we've definitely seen about 2 degrees Fahrenheit rise in land temperatures. We've also seen a rise in ocean temperatures. And what that means is that we're evaporating more moisture into the atmosphere. So because the oceans are also warming, we're going to see heavier downpours. That relates to rainfall, but also big snowstorms. There's just more moisture available in the atmosphere because of our current warming trend. We've seen some of the warmest years in the last couple of decades. In fact, the last 40 years have been the warmest for us. The years 2016 and 2020 are tied for the warmest years on record. So getting into some of the health impacts, and there's a lot we can talk about, but I'm going to give a brief summary today. We know that we're seeing shifting rainfall patterns, more extreme weather events, and that's going to correlate to heavier downpours, more destructive hurricanes. The increased heating, of course, tends to bring longer lasting heat waves. We just had one here in California in February. We had red flag territory. I'm just getting. Are you hearing that?
Yep.
Maybe we can have everyone.
Can you mute everybody? There you go.
All right. Okay, that sounds great. So more intense and long-lasting heat waves, that's going to affect ground level ozone. We know that ozone accumulates in hot, stagnant air. Those concentrations continue to increase as temperature rises. So that impacts respiratory health. We know we've seen some very destructive wildfires. Wildfire smoke is drifting from the west all the way to the east coast, and impacts to respiratory health are profound when it comes to wildfire smoke. We talked about higher precipitation of higher precip events, so higher rainfall events. That can also lead to more algae bloom, concerns about mold. These microorganisms are going to grow more efficiently in moist environments. On the flip side, we see severe drought in some locations. So it seems counterintuitive. There's the heavy rain, but there's also the more extreme side with dry weather and the impacts we're getting with wildfires. Another impact to respiratory health is obviously that we've seen longer allergy seasons, which is exactly what we're here to talk about today. More days above freezing are going to create longer growing seasons, which in turn affect the onset of allergy season. And to make things even more complex, we've got more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which means more pollen and stronger pollen for some of the common airborne allergens. We'll talk to the experts about that today. So let's go to our first panelist, Theresa Crimmins, director of the U.S. National Phenology Network. And Theresa, as meteorologists, we're looking at how these climate normals are shifting, and that's impacting our day-to-day weather. And I know you guys are looking at the data to see how this affects early leaf out and bloom across the country, which we're already seeing here in February. So what's the prospect for the upcoming spring season?
Well, thank you. Thanks, Crystal. That was a wonderful introduction. And I agree with you. It's not our imagination. Conditions are changing, and the consequences are allergies are getting worse. To kind of follow on with some of the things you just said, it's true. In the last several decades, temperatures have gotten warmer globally, and atmospheric carbon dioxide has increased. And those two ingredients are leading to more food for plants to be able to grow and make pollen. And in the last few decades, in about the last 30 years, we've seen the pollen season, the period of time in the spring when pollen is out in the air, increase by about 20 days. It used to be, depending on where in the globe you're located, but we're mostly talking Northern Hemisphere here, it used to be, about a month, mid-June to mid-July, and now we're looking anywhere from March to September. And Dan can speak to this even more as a hands-on person treating these kinds of things. There's a much greater prevalence of consequences for that too. In addition to the longer season, there's more pollen in the air. There's over 20% more pollen in the air, again, than we saw just 30 years ago. This is even more of a problem in urban areas where the warmth is intensified because of that urban heat island effect. It's warmer in urban areas versus rural. And researchers have seen, especially allergenic plants like ragweed, it grows faster, it flowers earlier, and it produces more pollen in those urban areas, as well as just now compared to when it used to. So things aren't going well for us. And another piece of the puzzle is with that increasing CO2, it's starting to look like those plants are producing pollen that has greater allergenicity as well. So there's more of it. It's available in the air for a longer period of time, and it's creating stronger responses in our human system. So it's not good. How do we know this? Well, basically, we've been tracking. Folks keep track of what's in the air. The picture in the upper left on this slide is a sampler where these are distributed out at various locations, usually in the roofs of buildings or in various urban locations. The map in the lower right shows some of the locations where these samplers are located and are part of a network called the National Allergy Bureau. Those samplers take samples of what's in the air, and then researchers have to collect those and look at them on a slide to figure out what the heck is actually present in the air. And so visually identify pollen and other particulate matter based on the shape and of what they're seeing on the slide, and then count them, manually, literally count them to get a sense for which things are high or low or not present. As you can see, there's a lot of locations on the map where there are not samplers located. And because we've got to look at the stuff manually and count it, it isn't instantaneous information. It takes a little bit of time before we know what the samplers are telling us. And also in a lot of locations, folks are not doing those counts either on the weekends or on holidays. And so there's a lot of gaps in that information that makes it harder to actually know what's going on and to be able to understand seasonally how things are changing across the country or how they're changing from year to year. So that's where my organization comes in. We're trying to help see if we can fill this gap. My organization, the USA National Phenology Network, one of the major things that we do is engage folks, volunteers all across the country, as well as professionals, in keeping track of what's happening over the course of the season in plants and animals. And one of those big things that folks report on is whether flowers are open. And we invite folks to track open flowers on really showy, beautiful things like plum and cherry trees, like Crystal was just talking about, which are beautiful and very charismatic and easy to see. But we also invite folks to keep track of things like open flowers in birch and maple and oaks, which are not as showy of flowers, as you can see on the slide here, but just as important from an allergen perspective. And so by using this app that we have called Nature's Notebook, we've had millions of records come in on this kind of information over the last 15 years. And we're now starting to look to see, are those records, those observations that people are submitting, are those a piece of the puzzle that we could use to enhance the information that we get from those samplers that we saw in the previous slide? And just some real quick preliminary results. The slide on the image on the right here is showing that our observers are actually tracking things at the species level. And so, whereas with the pollen counts, typically what folks are tracking when they're counting pollen grains is just at the genus level. So basically you get a count of pollen grains that are at the level of maple or oak or birch. Our flowering observations are, well, which maple is it? And in this case, the orange line on the left is red maple and the blue line on the right is sugar maple. And so what you can see there is that those two different species at this location in New Jersey actually have a pretty distinct time of year when they are flowering. And that is different than what you would get if you were just looking at the whole counts of maple with those species and any other maple species that are lumped in there combined. And so we're just kind of in an early stage with this, but it's looking promising that this could be an interesting piece of the puzzle and important for better understanding what's going on basically instantaneously across the country, to be able to try and assist folks like Dan who are, advising patients on what to do, as well as for treatment, and then as well as understanding how plants and plant communities are responding under continually changing global conditions like increasing carbon dioxide.
Thanks, Theresa.
Thank you. I'll stop there so I don't take up too much time. So I'm passing it back to you, Crystal.
I love that nature's notebook. And I know that the accumulation of everybody's work is going to help educate and help us make progress in this discussion about respiratory health. We're going to go to Landon, I believe, next. And Landon's with PollenSense. So what's your perspective? Tell us what you guys are doing in the realm of understanding pollen and allergies. I think you might be on mute. Now I'll mute myself.
I'm on mute. Okay, so I spent my entire PhD counting pollen, and it was hours and hours and hours. The process is you set out a trap, you collect the pollen, you bring in a 24-hour sample, you count manually. I put two people looking into a microscope because I thought the picture was funny here, but it does bring up the point that usually you don't get quality control on it on a daily basis or even on a weekly basis. Usually it's just one person that's trained to do it. You count that pollen literally manually one by one with a little clicker, and then you have to enter those data manually. And it was difficult and it took a lot of time. So when I finished, I said, I'm going to automate this. And I want to kind of explain why it's important to automate this. Right now in the entire world, there are roughly 800 manual pollen counting stations. 600 of those are in Europe. And Europe is really the only region of the world that has what is considered an adequate pollen counting network for daily averages. That's the cycle that manual counting happens on, daily averages. And if we were to extrapolate the adequate density to the rest of the world, we would need 12,000 sensors or 12,000 manual counting stations. If you were to conservatively say it's going to take about an hour and a half a day to count, some days it's going to be 4 hours, some days it's going to be 30 minutes, and not everyone counts year round. Although in the discussion leading up to this, as Dan mentioned, even if it's not pollinating in your region, the pollen can blow into your area from somewhere warmer further away. And so we really should be counting pollen and mold year round. So if you were to say an hour and a half a day on average for 365 days a year, and you were to pay that individual $22 an hour, that would be about $12,000 per station. Multiply that by 12,000 sensors or counting locations, that's $146 million a year to have a worldwide, well-funded manual pollen counting network. That doesn't scale. And so that's why we developed this sensor, the PollenSense APS, the automated particulate sensor. This sensor draws particles through the orifice there on the bottom. It traps those particles and then images them all. You can see on the far right there's an image of of particles captured with our device. Those particles are identified using machine learning, the same thing that your iPhone uses to identify your face to let you log into your phone. That's the kind of technology that we use to identify those particles. And we can scale this. This is something that can be distributed worldwide. If you looked at that $146 million a year, we could have a density 10 times what, at the cost of our sensor, we could have a density 10 times the density that would be considered adequate for daily average data. So let me talk about, let's go to the next slide, hourly data, because that's the goal. That's what our sensor does. And we did a study with Dan Dalan, who you'll hear from next. We have an app, it's called PollenWise. and it is connected to all the sensors in our network. We have sensors all over the world. The densest network is here in the US. And if you go to that app, you can see the hourly data, and you can log your data there, and you can compare your symptoms with the pollen levels, and you can begin to triangulate what you're allergic to. We took the anonymous data from the people logging their symptoms in here, and we started to look at what distance from a sensor is adequate. So the adequate 24-hour average data from the European network is a 2,700, one sensor every 2,700 square miles. What we found with hourly data is that at about 25 miles, the correlation begins to drop off, which means we need a sensor in every 25 by 25 mile grid, which is 625 square miles, which is much, much smaller than that 2,700 square mile adequate for daily averages. So the point here is pollen, because cities and countrysides and riverbanks and things vary so greatly, you really need a hyper dense network of sensors to describe what's going on and to begin to serve people and allow them to basically make decisions on real-time data. So we have a lot of work to do to get to what is going to be considered adequate for hourly data.
Good work, Landon.
Yeah, thank you, Landon. Wow, and speaking of data and how we can help the unbreathable world, let's go to Eric and talk more about what he's doing within DailyBreath. And you're on mute too.
That always happens. Well, thank you, Crystal. So now I'm going to talk about, start that segue from me to Dan and talk about the health perspective. So what I looked at was recognized that we really were not accommodating for the impact and the convergence of weather and environmental conditions together, right? Because when you go outside, you experience not just the pollen, but you experience the hot temperatures, the high humidity, and all of these have impacts on how the pollen spores are being experienced by you as an individual. So obviously in a changing climate, we need to be more attentive to our daily weather and environmental conditions that actually impact our health. And obviously, because of the changing climate, we do have these impacts on pollen presence, intensity, and allergenicity that are impacting us. So I've highlighted pollen here, but I also have heat and humidity because we're learning a lot about the dynamic of the impacts of heat and humidity on pollen, not just on a standpoint of the changing climate, but on how actually you experience it on a daily basis. So we'll get into a little bit more about that, but I wanted to highlight that it's not just pollen in isolation or heat in isolation. It's that you're experiencing these conditions all in the aggregate as a convergence of variables. The next slide really frames this from a problem perspective with asthma and specifically allergic asthma. So 70% of people who have asthma have some form of allergic asthma. And so what the problem is for the most part, the patient and the caregiver is currently living in the dark, really. We don't know what we don't know, and that's been kind of framed, right? We don't have enough detailed information about pollen so that people can take action to avoid those allergens that they might encounter during their day. So what we're really trying to do is figure out a way to, how do you reduce the uncertainty that a person has about something that is potentially problematic and creates a symptom threshold that leads to an asthma attack. And obviously, you know, part of the reason that's important is that these are really serious consequences, right? Symptom threshold is about experiencing multiple types of allergens that lead you to a tipping point where you have an asthma attack. And within asthma, you'll talk about airway inflammation, and you'll talk about bronchospasm, which is when you actually have an attack. Airway inflammation might be, you know, experienced from a symptom perspective in wheezing, right? But ultimately, a lot of this leads to that tipping point where somebody actually experiences an asthma attack. And if they don't get respiratory relief, that's going to lead to an ER visit or an inpatient hospital stay. And these attacks are extremely scary. I think if anyone's seen anybody who has had an asthma attack, they understand that this is respiratory distress. This is our breathing. It's something that the average person takes for granted, but for someone who has a respiratory condition like asthma or COPD, this is really serious stuff. And this particular citation is an article I read about 3 years ago about a young girl who had an asthma attack in Iowa on vacation and during the summer. Hot temperatures, high humidity. She's in the Midwest in Iowa, so there's probably some fertilizers and pesticides in the air and all kinds of stuff, right? And so this person ultimately is experiencing some level of airway inflammation that she may not even know, right? And ultimately it's building up. She ultimately had an incident because she went to a hotel pool that had chlorine in it. And chlorine can be really a toxic irritant for somebody who has asthma. So this article said doctors can't pinpoint what triggered the 15-year-old's asthma attack. Well, it's like, why are we pinpointing after the fact? Why can't we pinpoint the triggers before people experience asthma attacks and empower them to understand what they may experience and help them to avoid what we describe as potentially preventable asthma attacks? So what we do with Daily Breath is we do really three things. What we're really trying to do is record your flare. And it's for two purposes. One is to record all of the conditions when you experience that symptom. So there's winds, there's heat temperatures, there's humidity metrics, there's barometric pressure, there's all other kinds of things, in addition to pollen counts, in addition to what type of species level pollen is it, in addition to the specific types of pollutants. So there's two variables. One is the Daily Breath Risk Index, which is basically trying to ascertain what is the measurement of that convergence risk, right? All of those things are converging when you experience the environment. So that's one variable. And then the second thing is you're also tracking the data from an isolation perspective, because what you're trying to determine over time is, well, what are the most influential irritants or pollutants or allergens for you? Okay, so that really gives you a level of personalized understanding of what your exposures are that make you have asthma attacks, because we're all individually sensitive to these types of exposures differently. So that's actually manifested in something called the personalized risk index. So you'll see, I describe this as a daily breath forecast, because if you have an asthma condition, wouldn't you want to check a specific forecast that's relevant to you, not just kind of the weather forecast, but how am I going to experience the environment when I go outside? And then the last variable is something that's really unique in the sense that we track the actual location. And this is somewhat interesting in the sense that, as we've discussed, certain, and I love the slide that Theresa showed because it showed these different types of actually maple trees. You have to understand, tree counts are given as tree counts. They're not even given as maple tree counts, right? So we have trees, we have maple trees, and then we have red maple, we have sugar maple, and all these other kinds of things. And we don't have any way of having that granular level data until you have something like Landon's offering available that actually gets you down to that species level information. And so what you do is, over time, you're going to begin to understand with a map, where are those particular types of allergens present in the community? And so I envision having symptom heat maps that are actually associated with specific types of allergens so that you begin to understand. And when you see something like what Theresa's doing with the observatory network, then you really see that, like, we can identify where in different communities specific types of maple trees are located and how they're impacting people. So I'll segue from that into Dan, who's actually managing allergy and asthma patients and really has a unique view of kind of the personalization of asthma care.
Thanks, everyone. Wow, a lot of information. You know, what I'm learning so far is that we got a lot of work to do, but the people, all the panelists that's spoken so far has started it. You know, they have the expertise. We know where the problem is. We're getting there. there's still some work to be done. And so from my perspective, I've been taking care of patients, like you said here. And I just want to go back, to Crystal's point of view here. I did the study here in Fargo, North Dakota. You can see the arrow, 21 days increase in pollen. This is, the weed counts, et cetera. Essentially telling you what's being said. It's increasing. It's got some significance. And I was doing the counts, but I was also taking care of the patients. I was hearing them every day, and I was hearing them at the peak of the pollen season, et cetera, and then afterwards. I knew it was coming because I've been doing this for a long time. The patients are telling me something like, well, geez, I don't know, I don't need to know the pollen count. I already know because I'm having problems. Okay, now that's pretty telling. And then most of the patients that I see subsequently are after the peak of the pollen season, when they've been miserable for a long time, et cetera. We can still treat them. We give them all the medicines that they need, to get over it, and they will. But the moral of the story is, well, what Eric and everybody's been talking about, well, can we prevent that from happening? So that you're not suffering at the time of the year, when we know every time it's harvesting and every time it's spring, can your life be better ahead of time? And it truly is somewhat similar to finding out what the weather is. Okay, you can bring an umbrella, plan your things around an activity. Well, yeah, that's what we do on a medical sense. Climate is changing. You've heard it. It's increasing in pollen exposure. The severity is increasing. Thanks for all those notes. On people, talking to us here on the chat line. Allergic asthma truly is very, very personal, and in a population level, it affects a lot of people. It's increasing in severity and frequency. This is something that's been said already. It's increasing in prevalence. Eric touched on it a little bit, but I want to emphasize that there are vulnerable populations that don't have access to the pollen counts, et cetera. And, they're in a different part of the zip code. That is pretty important, but we're working on that. But look at all these things that are being affected by climate change, at a local level and at a big time level. Well, on the bottom right here, right before that, it's already happening. Okay, health impacts, climate change, it's already happening in my daily practice. I'm hearing that, I'm seeing that, and I'm telling you some examples now of people seeing me after the fact. But really, we need to prevent this from happening and getting worse. And how do we do that? Next slide is essentially, what Eric's been talking about. We want to personalize this. It's if you're on the next slide, oh yeah, there you are. Environmental policy, okay, was playing a major role, but personalized health is what I try to do. Okay, it's use your medicines ahead of time. Let's give you allergy shots. Let's find out what you're allergic to. Is it mold? Is it tree pollens? Is it grass? We can get that information. So the question is, what do we do with it? Okay. Pollen alerts, not just pollen, like Eric said, but the weather, et cetera, because environmental mitigation, that's a fancy word. Okay. Just make it better. Okay. Well, we can make the person better, but we can't control Mother Nature, but we can live with Mother Nature by knowing as much as we can about what to expect. Do I need to bring an umbrella tomorrow because of the weather? Do I need to make sure that this upcoming August, when they start harvesting, when there's a whole lot of weed pollens around, what do I do ahead of time? Way ahead of time, not after the fact. Okay, this really supplements what's going on, in my practice. I need that information from Eric, from Theresa. I did research with both of them. That's why we're here. All the things that Landon talked to you about is huge, as well as Theresa. The citizen scientists, by the way, that was those people that are helping Theresa out. We're calling you a citizen scientist, truly. There was a note there in the oral allergy syndrome. Those are people who can't, tolerate fresh fruits. Okay, they get tingling. They might even swell up. They might even have more severe symptoms. Now, guess what plants? Guess what fruits are? Okay, like bananas and all these fruits. They're plants. They cross-react to pollens from ragweed and birch tree pollens. Guess what they are? They're plants, and they're pollens, and they're circulating in the air certain times of the year. So yeah, it's not just affecting the nose and the lungs, but but the gut and your digestive system and food allergy. It's very prevalent. That's what I see all the time in my, in my practice. And so I very much appreciate that information that's coming from Eric and Theresa and Landon and Crystal, all that information you have, nationwide, even though I'm over here in the upper Midwest, we had thunderstorms and we had the derecho windstorms, that was affecting, many people throughout the Midwest. And part of that is responsibility for, some of the weather changes occurring in other parts of the country. But again, we need specialists like you guys to help predict and maybe look for something that, how can we prevent things in the future? Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dan. So we have a couple of questions that we're going to pose to the panel. These are based on some of the things that we've already talked about, but just anybody on the panel who wants to maybe delve into it a little bit more deeper. So the first question is, why is it important to understand with some level of specificity, not just pollen type, but within type, the actual species? And I have a citation here about mountain cedar trees that is intersecting with weather conditions to impact your allergy symptoms. So before people kind of respond to that, but I'll just kind of give my context, right? A lot of people don't understand that mountain cedar trees or specifically if the juniper class, basically have these big pine cones with pollen spores on top of the pine cones, kind of like, and those distribute, like when those pine cones are disturbed, that spores really distribute very easily, broken off of the cone, and then obviously in a cloud of dust or something like that can be easily inhaled. So maybe if you guys want to just kind of address the issue of specificity from that perspective. I know, Theresa, you already talked about red maple and sugar maple. Maybe you can start there.
Sure, though, honestly, I think Landon and Dan probably have good things to say too. Landon being that he was smack in the zone of where mountain cedar is, so prevalent, so abundant. And those trees, when you bump into them, when those pollen cones are open, there's just this massive cloud of yellow. It's and cars get covered with this film, just crazy film of pollen. Yeah, I think that, and I guess I was thinking Dan too, because I think a lot of it has to do with treating for the right thing and not over medicating, not overdoing it with especially steroids if you don't know exactly what it is that you're sensitive to. I think that's where this triangulation can really help. But yeah, I think what you're asking about is why is it that there's sensitivity to some species and not others? And
well, I also think, Theresa, just the fact that you identified within a particular community that one particular species could be presenting in April as kind of a high level of pollen presence, and then one other species, sugar maple, is presenting later in May.
Right.
It just shows the variation. And I think that's what we're really trying to bring to our audience, is the idea that there's specificity and there's actually changes in timelines that are, impacting how an allergic asthma patient is experiencing that specific, right? And Dan, you can talk about the fact that a lot of people just don't do allergy testing, so they don't really even know what they're allergic to, right? But, if they did, maybe they would know, oh, I'm allergic to sugar maple, right? Well, that means it's going to hit in May, but not April. Right? So these kinds of things are where we're trying to get that understanding of individual sensitivity to specific pollen types, which ultimately, Dan, you might be able to talk to this, is we may be able to move towards a path of precision medicine where we actually are able to prescribe medications that are specifically configured towards specific types of allergies or specific types of asthma conditions.
That's music to my ears as an allergy doctor, and that's what I've been doing all my career. It starts with the patient. 20% of the population have allergies, but to what? Like you said, and skin testing is personalized. We know specifically if it's a maple or weed or a ragweed. We can get down to the species level and even below that. And so, just to make it simple, we can do that for you in the office, and then we need all these other, measures and environmental mitigation, from you guys, information for you guys, because we can only concentrate primarily on the patient, but we can kind of point them towards the way of, what you can do outside of our clinic we try to do our best, but we can't provide all this information to the patients, all the time. We're concentrating at the health level. And so, yes, we can skin test you for specifically what it is, so that we can take our umbrella tomorrow and find out what to do and how to prevent it from occurring, in the future instead of in the past. But that's the point well taken, Eric.
So Crystal, maybe you can ask the second question.
Yeah, definitely. And thank you for everybody participating in the chat. Mark Rubin just said, with more and more people wearing smartwatches, having the capability to alert the patient to emerging triggers. I love, Dr. Dalan, you mentioned environmental mitigation. It's really trying to educate and provide tools and do everything we can to help people personalize their experience. And ultimately, it's like forecasting the weather. We have to be prepared. We can't look backwards, right? So let's talk about thunderstorm asthma. And obviously, let me move my screen so I can read it. The characterization would indicate it's a phenomena associated with weather conditions. But what causes the thunderstorms to have a unique impact on allergens that causes increased asthma symptoms and ER visits, as in Melbourne, Australia, several years ago? Okay, so from what I understand of thunderstorm asthma, and I'm curious to get everybody's input, especially maybe Dr. Dalan, that people watching may not understand really, is that the grass pollens get sucked up into the thunderstorm. There's a giant one right behind me. So you imagine the updraft within a thunderstorm. So you're getting these pollen grains that rise into the clouds, and they absorb water because there's a lot of moisture up there, right? Hence the heavy downpours we end up getting. And so as those pollen grains absorb water, they swell and they burst back down with the downdraft, and you're getting higher pollen counts as a result of that thunderstorm. Do you see this often with your patients, Dr. Dalan? I mean, this is a prime example of how weather can impact pollen.
I do. And I touched on the derecho thunderstorm 2 years ago here in Waterloo, in Iowa. And it was about a 12-hour period of strong gusty winds. And then there was some rain that was involved with that, et cetera. And we were actually able to get hour by hour pollen counts from Landon's device, and then I was also actually counting them, with the other device manually. So we were able to characterize those pollens that was occurring all that time. Yes, it burst the pollens, and that's the problem though. You can't see them. Once they're burst, we can't characterize what they are, and they're all over the place now. And so that increases the probability of running into somebody that's allergic to that. And so, you're talking about hundreds of miles that was affected in that derecho thunderstorm. And unfortunately, we haven't studied that quite yet. We're going to look at the data from the hospitals and emergency rooms, like they did in Melbourne, Australia. They already did that study over there. We wanted to do the study over here. It's a little harder to do because we have to look at the, HIPAA protections and laws. We're going to look at medical records from emergency rooms and hospitals. More than likely, it did affect a lot of people at that time because, you're talking hundreds of people, that's exposed, to the environmental elements, and then all the pollens that happens to be hanging around here. And this happened in the middle of August, which is the peak of the ragweed season. And so, yes, we see more people at the time as a result of the environment and the weather and things like that. And this needs to be reported. And we are reporting that. And it's being reported more and more than just Australia. Somebody's mentioned Canada. But you need to have those, the collecting devices. You need to have somebody, the weather is, people are doing that all the time already. Mm-hmm. That's awesome. But we need to have special devices like Landon's contraption. We need the National Phenology Network's input from citizen scientists. So this is a huge phenomenon that we're continuing to learn something about.
And Dan, I just wanted to add to that, just to give you another sense of the specificity issue, right? What people don't realize about Melbourne is that particular pollen was rye pollen, and rye pollen is extremely small or granular already. And so when that gets bombarded, you're even having smaller particles that are potentially inhaled. right? And so that's where that can become problematic. So again, that specificity issue coming back again. This last question really is for Theresa and some of the other folks. Theresa actually mentioned this, but again, there are issues of the intersection between pollution and pollen, right? Normally we hear of only two pollutants that are tracked, really PM 2.5 and ozone, but you have nitric dioxide, sulfur dioxide, a whole range of other pollutants. And I guess the question is how are those pollutants mixing up with pollen, right? I mean, and what is the impact on the pollutants on plant growth, the pollutants, I think I mentioned intensity, allergenicity, and volatility of pollen, right? Theresa, maybe you could start there.
I'm going to give you one of those typical scientist answers of like, well, it depends. No, this is what you're mentioning. What you're bringing up here is that there's a lot of different pieces to the puzzle and a lot of different interacting factors. And to my knowledge, we are really on the cutting edge on a lot of this. There is research, active research, to look at how plants, both their distribution and the timing of their activity, is impacted by some of those air pollutants that you described, like increased nitrogen or sulfur in the atmosphere. And that's, it depends on where you're at and whether, in some cases, the addition of nitrogen is like a fertilizer and causes the plants to increase their growth and increase their growing season. In other cases, it can really negatively impact them by kind of burning them. The specific impacts that has then on weather and how much they flower, and which then is the precursor for pollen in the air. I don't know that we've disentangled all of that yet. And the same thing for the amount of pollen and the allergenicity of the pollen, and how that's being impacted by these different changing conditions like increased CO2 and other things. I really only know of a couple of studies, and they've been primarily on ragweed. I think maybe there's one from Europe and on birch. I think it's birch, but it's really limited. However, that limited number of studies is pointing in the direction of, unfortunately, things are worsening from the perspective of human health. So really, I invite anybody else to chime in if there's more. Yeah, it looks like Dan does, but I guess I'll just say this is a huge opportunity. It really speaks to how we need to do a lot more research. But Dan, yeah, it looks like you got something to say.
Yeah, from a doctor's perspective in the population, I see a lot of people with occupational asthma. And so it's their personal space as well as important here. You're talking about huge, nationwide, global type of effects, which are huge and important. But then, from the doctor's perspective, I asked them, what kind of work do you do? Are they going to be exposed to more of this outside? Are you working outside? Are you primarily inside? Are you in the manufacturing business? I see somebody over here that's soldering, metals, and then somebody that's cutting up wood to make, a wood furniture. It's called occupational asthma. It's related to their unique personal space and environment, on top of all the things you guys started talking about at the global stage. So we have to look at it from that perspective, but also from the person's perspective.
If I could just add to what Dan said, Dan said exactly what I was going to say. We actually need, especially if you suffer from asthma, you need sensors where you are. You need to know what's in your own air. But if I could tie the three questions together, pollen is many pollen types are extremely hygroscopic, which means they absorb water readily. And that's what causes the thunderstorm asthma. That grass pollen absorbs it and then it explodes and it spills out all of these tiny little starch grains. Interestingly, the mountain cedar pollen, which is considered one of the most allergenic pollen types in the world, is also extremely allergenic. And there are studies comparing different cedar pollens and pollen types, and mountain cedar spills its allergens so much quicker that you get almost an instant response. And as a graduate student, I experienced that firsthand, that instant response, because I'm very allergic to mountain cedar pollen. I'm climbing through the trees. But when you combine that with the pollutants in the air. Imagine you've got a little bit of water and a little bit of mist or moisture in the air. If you have any kind of toxic gases or any kind of gases that create sensitivity, that pollen is going to absorb that liquid and bring that toxin into the pollen. And then when you inhale it and that pollen opens up and spills it all out, you're getting those toxins along with it. And we don't have a lot of good studies on this, but it's going to be an emerging field.
We had I had a question come in from somebody watching outside the chat, and I think it's important to address while we're still on here. Are all of the apps we're talking about and the tools available to the public at this point? I know with DailyBreath it certainly is. So we can give everybody more data and we can all take charge of our own health.
Yeah, I'll include, my final slide includes information about DailyBreath and PollenWise, as well as the Nature's Notebook, all three of those. And they are available. I know that PollenWise is available. It's a great thing for the spring. PollenWise gives you really the specificity. DailyBreath kind of gives you the personalization. And so I certainly encourage people to download it. Does anyone else have any other questions from for our panel?
Well, what we've seen in the chat are a lot of great comments, but something I was thinking of is, I don't know if Dr. Dalan wants to answer this, but to complicate matters even more for allergy sufferers and those with asthma, like my husband, for example, how is COVID playing into this? And post-COVID patients, are you seeing an increase in response to allergens in the air?
We're studying that as we speak. Tons and tons of data, including machine learning and artificial intelligence, are being brought in all over the world, and experts are looking at this. We're not quite sure yet. Some people are saying that there's some protective effects if you have allergies, from the worsening parts of COVID and vice versa. So I can't commit one way or the other. We need more data. But the immune response to COVID is very, very unique. The immune response to allergies that's affecting the nose and lungs is very, very unique. And there's always a play back and forth. There's the Army, Navy, Marines, they use different weapons. Our own immune system is the same thing. So it's maybe. And, stay tuned because we're actively studying it as we speak.
So I'd like to thank Crystal with Monarch Weather Consulting for being our moderator today. I want to thank Theresa Crimmins with the National Phenology Network, Landon Bunderson with PollenSense, and Dr. Dan Dalan, the allergist with MercyOne Medical Center. Thank you all for participating. I think we're actually, I love what Theresa said. I do think we're kind of collected a good group of people who are kind of on the leading edge of this particular topic, specifically pollen, because I think there's been a lot of focus recently about the air quality measurement metrics and all of that type of stuff, but there's not been a lot of discussion about pollen. And so I think, we are kind of blazing the trail to a certain extent, each in our own respective ways. So I appreciate that. The next slide. This is all of our contact information. And I just wanted to say, obviously, spring is around the corner. If you actually go to the National Phenology Network website, you will see several maps about the leaf bloom. I think they do it weekly, Theresa, where they introduce a map for leaf.
It's actually daily. Those maps are produced daily, and wonderful. 6 days into the future too.
Wonderful. Spring leaf and spring bloom. So that's really a great resource. And then obviously the Nature's Notebook. And then a great time to download PollenWise and DailyBreath and really try to prevent those allergy symptoms and potentially those preventable asthma attacks. So I really appreciate everyone's time and contribution to the panel. Crystal, did you want to say a couple final things? I should add, we are going to do our next webinar, I believe, on May 5th, Thursday, May 5th, which I'd like to note is World Asthma Day, I believe, is May 5th. It may be May 3rd. I'm not sure if it's Tuesday or Thursday, but I've got to confirm that. But that's when we're going to do our next webinar. And it's specifically going to focus as we start towards summer on the impact of heat overall on pollen and air quality, and then also specifically on wildfire smoke. And we'll talk a little bit about our wildfire smoke tracker that we have in DailyBreath. So Crystal, do you want to close out?
I just wanted to say there's one more question, but I think we'll take care of that in an email and get that back to Mark Rubin for the sake of time.
Okay.
And yeah, I've learned a lot by being part of this amazing group, and the intersection between pollen and allergies and weather. It's really important. And I think it's something we have to continue talking about. And I look forward to the webinar in May discussing wildfire smoke. So we know last year was a big year for wildfires and smokes. We've got to arm ourselves with as much knowledge as possible. Thank you.
Terrific. Well, thank you again, Crystal, Dan, Landon, Theresa. Thank you very much. Everybody have a great day.
Thank you.
And we'll talk soon. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Hello, Eric.
Hey, Mark, how are you?
It was really good.
Was it?
And I plan on sharing it with my two committees with Quad AI next week, because I think the value it brings